Hello everyone, my name's Ben and I teach people the anatomy of lifting to understand exercise. Today we're going to answer the world's most important question. What is the best biceps exercise? And I'm going to do it in one slide now, and that best exercise is curls. Now many of you are not surprised by this, but there are a lot of different curling variations that we can do, and to pick any single one of them and to label it as the best exercise, I think is kind of a silly thing to do. So what we're going to do today is talk about the differences between curls and specifically the first principles of biceps training so that you can pick the best exercise for you across all these different options. So what are some basic curling options we have available? Well, we have the standard dumbbell curl. We have the standard easy bar curl where this guy is, for whatever reason, shouting about how much his biceps are tearing apart and building back up. We have a cable curl here where the arms are out to the sides, and we also have something like a preacher curl, right, where the arms are more in front of the body. So how do we know the difference and how do we determine the difference between these variations? To answer that question, we need to understand the basic anatomy of the biceps and how the biceps differ in their position and their contractile length across these different exercises.
So to understand how different kinds of curls train the biceps differently, we simply just need to understand a few basic things about their anatomy, and I'm going to use this pink thing here to demonstrate the anatomy of both of the biceps. So there are two biceps, the one that sits on the inside, which is the short head, and then the one that sits on the outside, which is the long head, and both of the heads attach to this thing. This is called the shoulder blade or the scapula, and the short head of the biceps, the one that sits on the inside, attaches to this bony prominence called the coracoid process. It's this weird looking thing that sticks out, and the long head of the biceps, the one on the outside, sticks in and attaches to the top of this socket here called the supraglenoid tubercle. Now both of the biceps run from this bone to this bone over here, specifically called the radius, and what that means is that they can bend the elbow and they can also move the forearm. But for our purposes here, the differences between curls really comes down to the differences in shoulder position. So if we're thinking first about the short head of the biceps, which again right now I'm representing with this pink guy, we can start to think about, okay, how will this thing stretch and shorten the most? Obviously we have the elbow motion, but what happens when we change the position of our shoulder? Because that's really the biggest difference between curls, all of which are sort of palm facing the biceps. So if I'm thinking about stretching this short head the most, what I would want to do is essentially sort of pull my arm a little bit out to the side and a little bit backward. And if I wanted to shorten it the most, I would bend my elbow and then would bring my arm sort of closer to that attachment site where I would be doing a curl somewhere in front of my body. Now the long head is distinct from the short head because it doesn't have as much motion to it and it can't create as much motion, which means that because it runs in and toward the shoulder blade here, really where it's going to lengthen most is just basically with your arm at your side and or maybe slightly behind your body, and where it will shorten the most is if you kind of bring your shoulder up and overhead and do curls that way. So whether you're talking about the short head or the long head of the biceps, both simply act on the elbow similarly and the forearm similarly, but you would stretch the short head a little bit more with your arm a little bit wider, you would shorten it more with your arm sort of in front of your body, and then the long head of the biceps would potentially lengthen a little bit more with your arm sort of backward behind your body at your sides and or sort of more in that overhead position. So the differences between curls is very minor at the shoulder because the biceps don't really act on the shoulder in terms of actually moving it. That's what our pecs and our deltoids are for, but the biceps do subtly change in their length. So the solution to this is simply just to cover your bases by training different curls in different arm positions. If you choose any single variation of a biceps curl, you're probably missing out on some of the positions of either one of the biceps heads. So it doesn't really make sense just to pick a single or even two exercises. It makes sense to train biceps curls in a variety of different shoulder positions, whether your arm is sort of more out here, more to your side, more in front of your body, or more overhead in some position.
Now that we have a good understanding of the basic anatomy of the biceps and how the biceps stretch and contract differently in different shoulder positions, we need to remember two major things across all different curling variations that we're doing. The first thing we need to remember is to keep a supinated arm position, which we'll talk about in a second. And the second thing we need to remember is that we have a stable upper arm, meaning that we're using external objects to prevent any kind of rate limiter in the motion that would not be our biceps. So when we talk about this concept of supination, many people use the word supination as if it means palms up to the ceiling, but that's not actually the case because the relative position of your arm can change. So here's what I mean. Supination refers to this joint action here, which is a forearm specific joint action. It basically just refers to moving the radius bone, which is a bone in the forearm, over top of the ulna bone, which is the other bone in the forearm, to make them more parallel. Let me give you a quick visual demonstration about what I mean when I say supination in various arm positions.
So just to sort of visually demonstrate the purpose of keeping your palm more supinated whenever you're doing a curl, what we need to keep in mind is that any of the muscles that cross the elbow will have the most amount of leverage when they're sitting on the top side of the joint. And And so watch what happens if I move into what's called a pronated position, and watch specifically the attachment site of the biceps here, this pink thing here. If I move my forearm over this way, you can see how that kind of attachment site sneaks underneath of the arm, meaning that what happens is this green guy, the other elbow flexor, the brachioradialis, actually gains more leverage to bend the elbow. So doing any kind of reverse curl or any curl in neutral will still recruit the biceps to some degree, but for optimal recruitment, you want to keep your palm basically facing your biceps. And again, it's not about facing your palm toward the ceiling or facing it toward the floor, because if you face it this way and you're in a supinated position, but you move your arm this way, well, now all of a sudden your palm isn't facing the floor, it's facing that way, but you're still in a supinated position. So it's not about the relative position of the arm, it's about the relative position of these bones and specifically how it affects this attachment site.
Now, the second major principle that we need to remember about biceps training is that we need to stabilize the upper arm. And stability in the upper arm looks something like this, essentially where we have something behind the back of the upper arm to make sure that we can just really hone in on and isolate for the biceps and creating fatigue in the biceps as compared to other muscles which would control shoulder motion as compared to elbow motion. Key thing to remember here is that when we talk about the anatomy of the biceps are really not movers of the shoulder. They do cross the shoulder as we discussed, but they do not create a ton of motion at the shoulder. And so to train them, what we really need to focus on is motion of the elbow and not motion of the shoulder.
So just to visually demonstrate this concept of creating shoulder stability in any kind of curling motion, the principle remains the same pretty much across any curl that you're going to do, which is you want to have something like an external immovable object behind the bottom of the upper arm. Why? Well, because even if you're doing something like a dumbbell curl where the resistance wants to pull your arm straight to the floor, as soon as you initiate that motion, what many of you will notice is your arm will get shoved backward. And because your arm gets shoved backward, a lot of these shoulder muscles that have nothing to do directly with the most amount of contraction of the biceps have to now stabilize the shoulder in addition to you trying to move the arm. So the solution to this, in any case, is simply just to put something behind the bottom of the upper arm so that you can just focus on doing the curling motion without having to actually worry about stabilizing the shoulder. This applies to any position, not just a position at the arm. So even if your arm is in front of the body, you want something underneath of the arm here. If your arm is out to the side, you want something still under the back of the arm there. And if you're doing a curl overhead, you still want something underneath the arm here, because again, that's what's going to allow you just to isolate for the elbow motion and the maximal biceps recruitment you're capable of having in any of these contexts.
So now to put this into practical application, here are a ton of different curling variations that we can do, all of which are awesome options for the biceps across a week of training. The first variation I'm showing here is just a simple cable curl, and what you can see is per the relative angle of my torso compared to my arm is a little bit more in front of the body and slightly out to the side. So on a general level, we can say that this might train a shorter total muscle length of both of the biceps because again, the arm is in front of the body. But again, what you'll notice is even in this case, I'm not holding my arm up in front of my body out in space. I have a preacher bench to make sure that I'm stable. You can also simply use a regular bench, pull it up to a cable stack and stabilize your arm that way. Here are some other curling variations where my arms are at my sides. So this is an example of a cable curl, and what you'll notice is I'm actually using the cable machine itself to stabilize the back of the upper arm, and this, because my arm is sort of closer to my side, will train a relatively more stretched position of both of the biceps, although it will probably more than likely stimulate both of them fairly evenly. Remember that when you're doing any kind of curl, you're going to be stimulating both heads of the biceps. You don't need to be super pedantic and worried about all of the different muscle lengths of each of them and how they're changing dramatically, because they're not changing dramatically. Just remember that as a general rule, you want to just use different shoulder positions to train slightly different positions of the biceps so that over a week you're not sort of missing out on the potential stimulus that you could have to either one of the heads. So here's an example again of a cable curl where my arms are slightly behind my body, biceps slightly more stretched, and I'm pinning the back of my arms up against this cable machine to serve for that first principal function of keeping the upper arm stable. Here's basically a dumbbell version of that, and what you can see is I'm basically just using, this is a 45-degree hyperextension machine because a bench at this time that I was training was not available, and this is a really good way to just remember that because these are first principles, you don't need to be tied to using any one implement over another. You don't need to do a cable curl. You can just do a dumbbell curl. You can simply just pin the back of your arm up against a random object in the gym, and you don't have to be super particular about which implement that you use. Just as long as it serves the function of stabilizing the back of the upper arm, you're good to go. And both of these will train a relatively similar muscle length of the biceps, as I mentioned. And both of them are great options, whether dumbbell or cable. Now, additionally, you can do something like this, and you can see that this is quite similar to the first variation that I showed, but maybe my arm is slightly higher up, sort of in front of my body. So we could make the argument that this, again, is training a little bit more of a shortened position of both heads of the biceps. And again, same thing, first principles, stability is on the back side of my upper arm, on the bottom side of my upper arm, and I'm really making sure that the bottom of my upper arm stays glued to that bench throughout the entirety of this range. And then another variation here, which is sort of a similar version to the first one we went over, where now I'm using both of my arms. I'm keeping both of my arms in front of my body, and I'm just doing curls that way. This is with basically a pull down bar, and I'm angling a cable straight downward, and that's going to be another great option for your biceps training. Lastly, and again, just to sort of repeat and demonstrate the first principles here, this is an example where my arms are maybe wider out to the sides. I have the opportunity to actually use this Titan Fitness pad, which is basically a pad that people use for like step ups and stuff and ball slams. I just found it in the gym. I picked it up, I put it on a bench, and I used the stability of the pad that way so that, again, the back side of my upper arm could be super, super stable as I was going through the curl where my arm was a little bit wider. And again, per our discussion of the anatomy, this might in fact stretch the short head of my biceps just a little bit more because that arm path is slightly wider. But in any case, and regardless of which one of these variations that you choose, the principles are the same. Keep the palm facing toward the biceps. Remember that whole supination thing? It's not about where your palm is facing necessarily. It's about the fact the bones are in the right position to stimulate the biceps. And remember to put something behind the back of the upper arm. You can do single arm variations, double arm variations, whatever is more convenient. As an example, in this particular case, it was super convenient for me to just grab this pad and to pick it up off of the floor, but you may not have the ability to set this kind of exercise up in your gym. So what you can do instead is maybe just pull a bench up and do it single arm instead, so you're not taking up a bunch of room, and so that you can just sort of go back and forth between your single arm variations rather quickly, which inevitably won't take as much time as people generally think. Two arm variations and single arm variations alike are both great options. You just need to kind of find what's comfortable for you, what's practical for you, both in the acute and sort of chronic term. So overall, I hope this video was helpful for you. If you have any questions about the biceps or biceps training, please ask them in the comments below. If you like this video, please give it a share, please give it a like, and please subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one.